Condemned as a traitor, her life was brutally extinguished before a roaring, bloodthirsty mob. Yet just months prior, she was the revered mastermind who secretly dictated the fate of a nation from the quiet elegance of her private salon. She was Madame Roland. How did the brilliant architect of a new republic become the victim of its own terrifying collapse? This is the fall of Madame Roland that changed the course of revolutionary France. The brilliant strategist who would one day orchestrate national policy was forged in a world designed to keep her silent. Born in 1754, Jeanne-Marie Flippant entered a society that viewed female education with deep systemic suspicion. Many conservative thinkers openly argued that a woman's mind was biologically unsuited for complex statecraft. Yet, with formal higher education firmly closed, she quietly and fiercely rebelled. Retreating into the sanctuary of her father's library, she voraciously educated herself, consuming the works of Plutarch by the age of 8. This intense exposure to the heroes of antiquity left a permanent mark on her psychology, instilling a rigid, uncompromising sense of civic duty. Her terrifying political acumen did not suddenly appear when the revolution began. It was incubated over decades of solitary study in the shadows. The Enlightenment era was a time of profound contradiction. Philosophers loudly championed reason and universal liberty. Yet they largely excluded women from these very ideals. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who became her greatest intellectual idol, famously argued that a woman's primary duty was merely to comfort and obey her husband. Jeanne-Marie navigated this immense contradiction carefully. She absorbed Rousseau's radical political theories regarding the rights of citizens, while quietly ignoring his restrictive views on gender. She understood early on that direct rebellion would lead to social exile. Instead, she constructed a flawless public persona. She appeared to the world as a modest, dutiful daughter, and later, a devoted wife. This highly respectable facade became the perfect, impenetrable cover for her subversive ambitions. Her marriage to Jean-Marie Roland in 1781 is often analyzed as a strategic partnership rather than a passionate romance. 20 years her senior, Roland was a man of strict moral principles, though contemporary accounts often describe him as rigid and entirely lacking in natural charisma. Their courtship was highly unconventional, built not upon emotional declarations but through lengthy, rigorous philosophical letters. Following their marriage, they relocated to the provincial city of Amiens and later to Lyon. This prolonged period in the provinces is frequently glossed over in broader histories. Yet, several prominent biographers suggest it was the crucial incubator of her political genius. It was here that she first learned to operate as an unseen collaborator. Jean-Marie Roland, in his capacity as an inspector of manufactures, was tasked with writing complex economic articles for the Encyclopédie Méthodique. It was a massive, prestigious intellectual undertaking. Archival evidence reveals a fascinating shift in his published writing style during this specific period. The prose abruptly became sharper. The economic arguments grew more forceful. The philosophical depth of his reports increased significantly. Historians widely attribute this sudden transformation to the hidden hand of Jeanne-Marie. She was no longer functioning merely as a supportive wife. She had become his uncredited co-author. She meticulously organized his field notes. She conducted his historical research. She drafted his final manuscripts. Through this grueling daily work, She learned how to project her own powerful voice through a male proxy. It was a necessary pragmatic survival skill for an ambitious intellect trapped in an 18th century woman's life. When the French Revolution violently erupted in 1789, the Rolands were still living in Lyon. The news from Paris was electrifying. The Bastille had fallen. The ancient feudal order was visibly crumbling. Jeanne-Marie observed these seismic events with intense calculating fascination. She did not remain a passive spectator to history. She immediately began writing political articles for a local Republican newspaper. She published them entirely anonymously. Her writings from this early period demonstrate a radical, uncompromising vision of liberty. Some scholars note that her provincial essays were actually far more revolutionary than the early writings of the men who would later lead the Girondin faction. Simultaneously, she began to build an extensive network of correspondence. She wrote detailed analytical letters to prominent political figures stationed in Paris. She offered them acute assessments of the political climate. She provided them with highly accurate reports on the public mood in the volatile southern provinces. She deliberately positioned herself as an invaluable, reliable source of intelligence. She was weaving a complex web of political influence from hundreds of miles away. Men like the prominent journalist Jacques-Pierre Brissot began to rely heavily on her written insights. They recognized the undeniable brilliance of the mind behind the letters. However, they likely did not realize the full, terrifying extent of her political ambition. During her time in Lyon, the severe social inequalities of the era were starkly visible. The city was a major European center for silk manufacturing. The labor conditions for the workers were brutal and exploitative. Jeanne-Marie witnessed the desperate suffering of the working poor firsthand. Some historical records suggest this grim reality hardened her political resolve against the monarchy. However, her brand of republicanism remained distinctly bourgeois. She believed deeply in constitutional liberty and the absolute rule of law. She did not, however, believe in social leveling or the redistribution of wealth. Most importantly, she harbored a deep visceral fear of uncontrolled mob violence. This fundamental distrust of the uneducated lower classes would later become the fatal ideological fault line between her Girondin allies and the radical Jacobins. It was a deeply ingrained prejudice that would eventually cost her everything. When the Rolands finally received the call to relocate to Paris in early 1791, she was already fully prepared for war. She was not a naive provincial wife stepping nervously into the political arena. She was a seasoned, highly disciplined political strategist. She understood the immense power of the printed word. She understood the delicate mechanics of public propaganda. She understood exactly how to manipulate the egos of ambitious, insecure men. She had spent a full decade perfecting the dark art of shadow power. The elegant drawing room of her new Parisian apartment was merely the grand stage for a political play she had been rehearsing in her mind for years. The Rolands arrived in Paris in February 1791. The capital was a powder keg of political anxiety and soaring idealism. They initially settled into a modest apartment at the Hôtel Britannique on the Rue Guénégaud. It was within these unassuming walls that she established her first true political salon. This was not a space for frivolous aristocratic socializing. It was a rigorously disciplined intellectual war room. She hosted gatherings 4 times a week. The guest list was meticulously curated. She understood the delicate optics of her gender in a deeply patriarchal society. Therefore, her behavior during these salons was a masterclass in calculated subservience. She rarely sat at the center of the room. She preferred to position herself at a small desk near the window. She would often sew or write letters while the men debated. She maintained the visual illusion of a traditional passive wife. However, those present quickly realized who was truly directing the conversation. When the debate stalled, she would interject with a quiet, razor-sharp observation. She possessed an extraordinary ability to synthesize complex arguments and offer a decisive course of action. Prominent journalists and deputies began to rely entirely on her quiet interventions. Jacques-Pierre Brissot was one of her most frequent guests. He was a highly influential journalist and a central figure among the moderate Republicans. He was utterly captivated by her political intelligence. Through Brissot, her salon attracted the brightest minds of the emerging Girondin faction. Jérôme Pétion, who would soon become the mayor of Paris, became a regular attendee. Yet the most significant introduction was a young melancholic deputy named François Buzot. The relationship between Madame Roland and Buzot adds a profound layer of emotional complexity to her political calculations. Historical documents, specifically a cache of secret letters discovered decades after her death, reveal a deeply passionate connection between them. It was, by all reliable accounts, an unconsummated platonic romance. She was fiercely dedicated to her marriage vows and her public virtue. However, Buzot became her ultimate intellectual equal and her emotional anchor. This hidden love affair heavily influenced the Girondin trajectory. Some biographers argue that her fierce defense of Girondin policies was deeply intertwined with her desire to protect and elevate the man she secretly loved. This emotional undercurrent humanizes the often cold, calculating image of the female strategist. There is another frequently overlooked detail regarding these early salons. The guest list was not exclusively Girondin. During the spring of 1791, one of her most regular visitors was a quiet, intensely serious lawyer from Arras. His name was Maximilien Robespierre. The future architect of the Reign of Terror once sat in her drawing room, sharing tea and discussing the rights of man. Early correspondence indicates a mutual cautious respect between them. She initially admired his rigid dedication to revolutionary principles. However, the psychological friction between Madame Roland and Robespierre soon became apparent. She was an elitist intellectual. She believed the revolution should be guided by educated property owners. Robespierre was increasingly aligning himself with the volatile, uneducated working classes of Paris. Furthermore, he was deeply uncomfortable with the visible influence of a woman in political affairs. Some historians suggest that his later, relentless persecution of the Girondins was partly fueled by his lingering resentment of her intellectual dominance in those early salon meetings. The fracture of their fragile alliance would eventually determine the bloody course of the revolution. By late 1791, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. The Girondins were pushing aggressively for war against Austria. They believed a foreign war would expose the treacherous sympathies of King Louis XVI and unite the fractured French nation. Madame Roland was a fierce vocal advocate for this military conflict. She used her extensive correspondence network to rally provincial support for the war effort. This is a point of considerable historical debate. Many modern scholars view the Girondin push for war as a disastrous miscalculation that ultimately radicalized the revolution and led to the Reign of Terror. Yet at the time, she viewed it as a necessary crucible for the new republic. In March 1792, the king capitulated to immense political pressure. He agreed to form a new cabinet composed entirely of Girondin ministers. Marie Roland was appointed as the Minister of the Interior. This was the moment she stepped entirely out of the provincial shadows. The couple relocated to the opulent ministerial palace on the Rue Neuve des Petits Champs. She did not remain in the residential wing. She immediately established her own desk in his private office. The sheer volume of work she undertook is staggering. The Ministry of the Interior was responsible for the domestic administration of the entire country. It oversaw everything from agriculture and trade to public order and education. Surviving documents from the ministry archives show her distinct handwriting across countless drafts of official policy. She received delegations of provincial officials. She summarized complex national reports for her husband. She effectively functioned as his chief of staff, his primary policy advisor, and his lead speechwriter. Her most audacious political maneuver occurred in June 1792. The newly formed Legislative Assembly had passed two highly controversial decrees. One demanded the deportation of conservative priests who refused to swear allegiance to the state. The other called for the establishment of a massive armed camp of 20,000 provincial guardsmen outside Paris, designed to protect the capital from foreign invasion. King Louis XVI, exercising his constitutional right, vetoed both decrees. The Girondin ministry was thrown into a crisis. Madame Roland saw an opportunity to force a decisive confrontation with the monarchy. She convinced her husband to send a formal letter of protest directly to the king. Historical consensus heavily supports the assertion that Jean-Marie Roland did not write this letter. He merely signed it. And Madame Roland drafted the entire document in a single, intense sitting. The tone of the letter was unprecedented. It did not use the deferential language traditionally reserved for a monarch. It was a blunt, forceful ultimatum. She lectured the king on his constitutional duties. She warned him that his continued use of the veto would lead directly to the violent overthrow of the throne. She stated that the French people would inevitably view him as an enemy of the revolution if he continued to protect rebellious priests and block military defenses. It was a masterclass in political brinkmanship, orchestrated entirely by a woman who officially held no power. The immediate consequences were explosive. The king was deeply insulted by the sheer audacity of the letter. On June 13th, he summarily dismissed Jean-Marie Roland and the other Girondin ministers. However, she had already anticipated this reaction. Before the king could suppress the document, she had arranged for copies to be sent to the National Assembly. The letter was read aloud to the cheering deputies. It was immediately printed and distributed across the nation. Her calculated gamble paid off spectacularly. Her husband was stripped of his office, but he was instantly elevated to the status of a national hero. The Girondin faction gained immense popularity in the provinces. The public perception of the king was fatally damaged. She had successfully used the monarch's own constitutional authority to orchestrate his political isolation. The monarchy would fall completely just 2 months later, in August 1792. The Girondins would be swept back into absolute power. Yet, in engineering this triumph, she had inadvertently accelerated the radicalization of the Parisian mobs. She had helped unleash a chaotic, uncontrollable force that would soon turn its violent gaze toward her own magnificent, fragile empire. The summer of 1792 violently dismantled the old world. On the 10th of August, the simmering rage of the Parisian working classes boiled over. Armed citizens stormed the Tuileries Palace. The Swiss guards were massacred in the courtyards. The ancient French monarchy, which had stood for centuries, collapsed in a single afternoon of bloodshed. King Louis XVI and his family were imprisoned. The political vacuum was immediate and terrifying. In the chaotic aftermath, the newly formed Republican government desperately needed experienced administrators. The National Assembly immediately recalled the Girondin ministers. Jean-Marie Roland was reinstated as Minister of the Interior. Madame Roland returned to the opulent ministerial palace. However, the political reality had fundamentally changed. They were no longer the radical outsiders pressuring a reluctant king. They were now the government. They were tasked with maintaining order in a nation that was rapidly spiraling into anarchy. This second term in office marked the absolute peak of her hidden power. It also marked the beginning of her profound psychological disillusionment. She had constructed her political philosophy on the idealized writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. She genuinely believed in the inherent goodness of the common citizen. She believed that liberty would naturally produce civic virtue. The brutal reality of the Parisian streets shattered this intellectual illusion. In early September, the capital was gripped by a terrifying paranoia. Foreign armies were advancing toward Paris. Rumors spread rapidly that political prisoners held in the city's jails were plotting a massive uprising. The radical elements of the city, unchecked by any central authority, took matters into their own hands. Over a period of 4 days, armed mobs moved from prison to prison. They dragged out priests, aristocrats, and common criminals. They subjected them to makeshift trials and slaughtered them in the courtyards. Over 1,000 people were hacked to death with swords, axes, and pikes. Historians refer to this event as the September Massacres. For Madame Roland, it was an emotional and philosophical catastrophe. She was horrified by the raw, uncontrolled violence. She sat in the Ministry of the Interior, receiving frantic reports of the slaughter, completely powerless to stop it. The abstrait concept of a glorious revolution had suddenly turned into a horrifying spectacle of murder. She immediately placed the blame for the massacres on the radical Jacobin leaders. She firmly believed that men like Jean-Paul Marat and Georges Danton had either actively orchestrated the violence or deliberately allowed it to happen to consolidate their own power through terror. From this moment forward, her political strategy hardened into a rigid, uncompromising crusade against the extreme left. She saw the Jacobins not merely as political rivals, but as a deadly disease threatening the fragile new republic. To combat the growing influence of the Parisian radicals, she utilized the full resources of the Ministry of the Interior. She transformed her hidden role from a policy advisor into a director of national intelligence and propaganda. She formally organized the Bureau of Public Spirit. This was an unprecedented government agency. Its sole purpose was to shape the political ideology of the French populace. She personally managed the distribution of vast amounts of literature. She funneled government funds to moderate newspapers that supported the Girondin cause. She drafted circulars that were sent to local mayors and administrators in all 83 departments of France. These documents praised the virtues of law, order, and respect for property. Crucially, they also carried a distinct underlying message. They warned the provincial citizens against the chaotic, bloodthirsty mobs of Paris. Many scholars argue that this was her most fatal strategic error. In her desperate attempt to save the Republic from mob rule, she actively widened a dangerous geographical divide. She pitted the quiet, conservative provinces against the radical, volatile capital. She failed to understand that the true power of the revolution no longer resided in the intellectual arguments or provincial voting blocs. It resided in the armed, angry crowds patrolling the streets right outside her window. Her hatred for the Jacobins was deeply personal, and she focused it intensely on two men. The first was Georges Danton. He was the newly appointed Minister of Justice. He was a man of the streets. He was loud, pragmatic, and highly charismatic. Danton understood the necessity of compromise. He repeatedly reached out to the Girondins. He offered to form an alliance to stabilize the government. He was willing to overlook their political differences to present a united front against the advancing foreign armies. Madame Roland vehemently rejected these overtures. She found Danton morally repugnant. She was repulsed by his coarse language, his suspected financial corruption, and his undeniable connection to the September massacres. She convinced her husband and her closest political allies, including Brissot and Buzot, to refuse any cooperation with him. She instructed the Girondin deputies to publicly attack Danton in the newly formed National Convention. She demanded that he account for missing government funds. This uncompromising moral rigidity sealed her fate. Danton was a dangerous man to humiliate. By rejecting his alliance, she pushed him firmly into the camp of the radical Jacobins. She united her enemies against her. The second man she targeted was Jean-Paul Marat. He was a radical journalist who published the highly influential newspaper, The Friend of the People. Marat was a master of populist rage. He recognized the immense power Madame Roland held over the Girondin faction. He decided to destroy her public reputation. Marat launched a relentless, vicious campaign against her in the press. Bypassing her political arguments entirely, Marat launched a vicious, targeted assault on her gender. Playing upon deep-seated prejudices, he portrayed her as a scheming temptress, using her feminine wiles to manipulate the weak-minded men of the Republic. He accused her of hosting extravagant, aristocratic banquets while the poor of Paris starved. He painted her as the modern equivalent of a corrupt queen, secretly dictating the fate of the nation from her lavish drawing room. These attacks were highly effective. The working classes of Paris, the sans-culottes, began to view her with deep suspicion and hatred. The public image she had carefully crafted was being systematically dismantled. She was no longer seen as the virtuous, supportive wife of a dedicated public servant. She was increasingly viewed as a dangerous, shadowy puppet master. The atmosphere inside the ministry grew suffocating. She worked exhausting hours at her desk. She slept very little. The stress of managing a hostile political environment took a severe toll on her physical health. Surviving letters from this period reveal a woman pushed to the edge of exhaustion. Yet she refused to back down. She continued to write speeches for the Girondin deputies. She continued to manage the flow of propaganda. She continued to host her political dinners, although the guest list had shrunk considerably as the danger grew. Her relationship with François Buzot deepened during these terrifying months. They exchanged daily letters. Their correspondence was filled with shared anxieties about the future of the Republic. They found solace in their mutual commitment to their ideals. She poured her emotional energy into this platonic connection. It provided her with a private sanctuary amidst the relentless public attacks. However, this close association also made Buzot a prime target for the Jacobins. By the winter of 1792, the political situation was critical. The trial of King Louis XVI consumed the National Convention. The Jacobins demanded the immediate execution of the monarch. They argued that the king's death was necessary to secure the Republic. The Girondins, guided largely by Madame Roland's cautious strategy, hesitated. They were not necessarily royalists, but they feared the domestic and international consequences of executing a king. They proposed holding a nation all referendum to decide his fate. The Jacobins seized upon this hesitation. They loudly accused the Girondins of being secret royalist sympathizers. They used the trial to permanently discredit the moderate faction in the eyes of the Parisian public. When the king was eventually sent to the guillotine in January 1793, the Girondins were fatally weakened. Their attempt to save the king's life, or at least delay his execution, was viewed as a betrayal of the revolution. The pressure on Jean-Marie Roland became unbearable. The radical press constantly attacked him. Armed crowds frequently gathered outside the ministry, screaming insults at his windows. Recognizing that his position was no longer tenable, he resigned as Minister of the Interior just 2 days after the king's execution. He stepped down from official power, but the damage was already done. Madame Roland had built a formidable political machine, but she had lost control of the streets. The Jacobins now dominated the National Convention. They had the support of the armed Parisian populace. The Girondins were isolated, demoralized, and rapidly losing ground. The shadow power she had wielded so effectively was now entirely useless against the brute force of an angry, organized mob. The final, desperate struggle for survival was about to begin. The resignation of Jean-Marie Roland in late January 1793 marked a definitive turning point. The couple vacated the opulent ministerial palace. They retreated to a smaller, far less conspicuous apartment on the Rue de la Harpe. This physical withdrawal mirrored their rapidly diminishing political influence. Madame Roland was no longer the unseen architect of national policy. She was now a private citizen in a city that was growing increasingly hostile to her very existence. The political atmosphere in Paris during the spring of 1793 was suffocating. France was besieged on all sides. Following the execution of King Louis XVI, a vast coalition of European monarchies, d'éclat, read war on the new republic. Simultaneously, a massive, bloody royalist rebellion erupted in the western region of the Vendée. The nation was fighting a desperate war for survival on both foreign and domestic fronts. Panic gripped the capital. The economy was in a state of rapid collapse. The value of the assignat, the revolutionary paper currency, plummeted. The price of basic necessities, particularly bread, skyrocketed beyond the reach of the working classes. Hunger is a potent political catalyst. The poorest citizens of Paris, the sans-culottes, demanded immediate aggressive government intervention. They demanded strict price controls on grain. They demanded the harsh punishment of anyone suspected of hoarding food. These demands were heavily championed by the radical Jacobins and an even more extreme faction known as the Enragés. The Girondins, however, remained rigidly tied to their economic philosophy. Madame Roland and her allies were staunch defenders of private property and free trade. They believed that government interference in the market would only worsen the crisis. They viewed the demands for price controls as a dangerous violation of the very liberties the revolution had fought to secure. They refused to compromise. They lectured the starving populace on the virtues of economic theory. This intellectual rigidity proved to be a fatal miscalculation It completely alienated the working classes. It allowed the Jacobins to present themselves as the true defenders of the people while painting the Girondins as wealthy, indifferent elitists. The situation deteriorated further in April 1793. General Charles-François Dumouriez, the commander of the northern French army and a prominent ally of the Girondins, committed a devastating act of treason. After suffering a major military defeat, he attempted to turn his own troops against the Republic. When that failed, he defected to the Austrians. The fallout in Paris was catastrophic. The Jacobins immediately seized upon the defection. They accused the entire Girondin faction of being complicit in a massive royalist conspiracy. The fact that Madame Roland had previously hosted Dumouriez in her salon was presented as undeniable proof of her treason. In a desperate, ill-advised attempt to regain control, the Girondins made a disastrous tactical error. They used their remaining influence in the National Convention to order the arrest and trial of Jean-Paul Marat. They accused the radical journalist of inciting violence and attempting to destroy the national legislature. It was a massive gamble. Madame Roland strongly supported this aggressive move. She believed that a public trial would expose Marat as a dangerous demagogue and break his hold over the Parisian mobs. The trial was a spectacular failure for the Girondins. The revolutionary tribunal, heavily influenced by the radical factions, swiftly acquitted Marat. He was not merely released. He was carried out of the courtroom on the shoulders of an adoring crowd. He was brought back to the National Convention in absolute triumph, crowned with oak leaves. This event completely destroyed the Girondins' remaining authority. It demonstrated clearly that the legal institutions of the Republic were now controlled by the streets. The Girondins had attempted to use the law to crush their enemy, and the law had turned against them. By late May, the radical sections of Paris began to openly organize an armed insurrection. They established an illegal central committee at the Hôtel de Ville. They demanded the immediate expulsion and arrest of 22 leading Girondin deputies. They also demanded the arrest of Madame Roland. They no longer bothered to disguise their intentions. The destruction of the moderate faction was imminent. The climax arrived on May 31st, 1793. The alarm bells of the city, the tocsins, began to ring at dawn. The city gates were firmly closed. Thousands of armed citizens, supported by the radicalized National Guard, RD, surrounded the Tuileries Palace where the National Convention was holding its session. They trained their cannons directly on the legislative building. The deputies were effectively held hostage by their own citizens. Inside her apartment on the Rue de la Harpe, Madame Roland received frantic updates. She understood that the political machine she had helped construct was now functioning as an executioner. Her husband, fearing immediate assassination, made the decision to flee. With the help of a loyal friend, Jean-Marie Roland slipped out of the apartment in disguise. He successfully evaded the guards at the city gates and disappeared into the countryside, eventually finding refuge in Rouen. Madame Roland was left alone in Paris. It was at this precise moment of absolute crisis that she made a decision that profoundly highlights the contradictions of her life. For years, she had meticulously adhered to the rules of shadow power. She had remained behind the curtain. She had never spoken in a public assembly. Yet, as the armed mob surrounded the government, she decided to step into the light. She drafted a passionate letter to the National Convention. She intended to march directly to the Tuileries Palace, demand entry, and read the letter aloud to the deputies. She wanted to publicly defend her husband's innocence and denounce the illegal insurrection taking place outside their doors. She dressed carefully. She walked through the chaotic, crowded streets of Paris, completely unescorted. She pushed her way through the armed cordons. When she finally reached the doors of the assembly, she was denied entry. The guards refused to let her pass. The deputies inside were paralyzed by fear and internal division. They were entirely unwilling to halt their proceedings to listen to a woman. She waited for hours in the antechambers, pacing the floors, demanding to be heard. It was a deeply tragic irony. The woman who had secretly dictated national policy for over a year was physically barred from the room when she finally demanded the right to speak for herself. The system she had intellectually nurtured was entirely deaf to her actual voice. Defeated and exhausted, she returned to her apartment late that evening. The streets had grown unnervingly quiet. It was the heavy silence that precedes an inevitable blow. She knew the authorities were coming for her. She did not attempt to flee. Some historians suggest she was simply too exhausted to run. Others argue that flight would have felt like an admission of guilt, a betrayal of the stoic Roman virtues she had idolized since childhood. The arrest occurred on the evening of June 1st. A delegation from the Radical Section Committee arrived at her door. They presented a warrant for her imprisonment. The charge was deliberately vague, citing her involvement in a conspiracy against the unity of the Republic. She received the men with perfect, chilling courtesy. She did not raise her voice. She did not protest her innocence. She merely asked for time to pack a few belongings and to arrange for the care of her 12-year-old daughter, Eudora. The parting with her daughter was swift. She entrusted Eudora to the care of a loyal governess. She understood the immense psychological danger of displaying maternal weakness in front of her captors. She maintained a stoic facade. She descended the stairs of her building and stepped into the waiting carriage. As the carriage moved through the narrow streets, crowds of citizens gathered. They recognized her immediately. They followed the carriage shouting insults and demanding her death. Some accounts record that the guards offered to close the blinds of the carriage to protect her from the mob. She refused. She sat perfectly upright, looking directly at the angry faces surrounding her. She was initially taken to the Abbaye prison. It was a grim, heavily fortified structure. The conditions were severe. She was placed in a small, damp cell. The air was faux. The walls were thick stone. Yet her immediate psychological reaction to imprisonment was completely unexpected. Surviving letters written during her first weeks in the Abbaye reveal a woman who did not feel crushed by her confinement. Instead, she described experiencing a profound, almost euphoric sense of relief. For over 2 years, she had carried the crushing burden of a crumbling government. She had lived in a constant state of political anxiety, attempting to hold back the tide of radical violence. The moment the cell door locked behind her, that immense responsibility vanished. She was no longer required to manage the state. She was no longer forced to interact with men she despised. The physical imprisonment paradoxically granted her a profound intellectual freedom. She had lost her empire, but she had regained control of her own mind. She immediately established a strict daily routine. She requested that her friends smuggle in basic supplies. She transformed the small wooden table in her cell into a new, solitary workspace. She surrounded herself with the books that had shaped her youth. She reread Plutarch's Lives. She studied English philosophy. She read the histories of the Roman Republic. She found deep comfort in these ancient texts. They provided a vast historical context for her own suffering. They reinforced her belief that true virtue often requires martyrdom. It was in this damp cell that she began her most significant literary endeavor. She started writing her memoirs, which she titled An Appeal to Impartial Posterity. She wrote with a frantic, desperate energy. She knew that her trial would be a sham, and her execution was a certainty. Her only remaining weapon was the historical record. She was determined to shape the narrative of the Girondin faction before the Jacobins could entirely erase it. She wrote extensively about her childhood. She detailed her intellectual awakening. She provided sharp, uncompromising portraits of the political figures she had known. Her assessments were often brutal. She did not spare her former allies if she felt they had acted with cowardice. She fiercely defended her husband's administrative record. The manuscript pages were written hastily and secretly. Whenever a trusted friend, usually the journalist Luc Champagneux, was permitted a brief visit, she would quietly slip the folded pages into his coat. Champagneux bravely smuggled the documents out of the prison and hid them, ensuring they would survive the reign of terror. However, the memoirs were not her only writing. During her months in prison, she engaged in a highly dangerous, deeply emotional correspondence. She managed to establish a secret line of communication with François Buzot. Following the collapse of the Girondins, Buzot had managed to escape Paris. He was hiding in the Normandy region, desperately attempting to organize a provincial army to march on the capital and overthrow the Jacobins. The letters she sent to Buzot from her prison cell are extraordinary historical documents. They strip away the cold, calculating exterior of the political strategist. They reveal a woman experiencing an intense, agonizing collision of political despair and passionate love. In these letters, she confessed her feelings with an openness she had never permitted herself in freedom. She wrote that the physical walls of the prison were a strange blessing. They provided an insurmountable barrier that preserved her moral duty to her marriage, while finally allowing her to express the absolute depth of her love for Buzot. She urged him to continue fighting for the Republic, even as she acknowledged that their cause was likely lost. She did not ask him to attempt a rescue. She knew it was impossible. She only asked that he remember her and that he stay true to the moderate Republican ideals they had both championed. These letters highlight the fragile beauty of human connection existing within a framework of terror. She was facing the guillotine, yet her primary emotional focus was not fear, but the preservation of a platonic love that had been her only true sanctuary in a violent world. As the summer progressed, the political terror intensified. The Jacobins consolidated their absolute control over the state machinery. The prisons of Paris filled rapidly with anyone suspected of disloyalty. In late June, Madame Roland was briefly released from the Abbaye, only to be immediately rearrested at her own front door in a cruel psychological tactic designed by the revolutionary police. She was subsequently transferred to the Saint-Pélagie prison. Saint-Pélagie was known as a place for prostitutes and common criminals. The environment was loud, chaotic, and deeply degrading. The intellectual isolation she had cultivated in the Abbaye was shattered. She was forced to share close quarters with women she considered morally abhorrent. Yet she maintained her rigid discipline. She continued to write. She organized a small routine for herself amidst the squalor. She even managed to charm some of the prison guards, convincing them to bring her fresh flowers and better writing paper. Her ability to command respect, even in the most debased circumstances, remained intact. By the autumn of 1793, the reign of terror was fully institutionalized. The law of suspects was passed, allowing for the arrest of almost anyone based on mere suspicion of anti-revolutionary sentiment. The Revolutionary Tribunal operated with terrifying speed. The moderates were being systematically eradicated. In October, the 22 Girondin deputies who had not managed to escape were put on trial. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. They were all condemned to death and executed on October 31st. The men who had once gathered in her drawing room to debate philosophy were now buried in a mass grave. Madame Roland knew her turn was approaching. On October 31st, the very day her former allies were executed, she was transferred to the Aïdiba Conciergerie. This was the final stop. It was the dark, heavily guarded prison located directly adjacent to the Revolutionary Tribunal. It was universally known as the antechamber of death. The dampness here was severe. The cells were crowded and diseased. Marie Antoinette had been held in this same prison just weeks prior, before her own execution. Upon entering the conciergerie, Madame Roland seemed to accept the finality of her situation. She stopped writing her memoirs. She wrote a few final heartbreaking letters to her daughter and to her loyal servant. She prepared herself psychologically for the public spectacle of the trial and the scaffold. She understood that the Jacobins intended to use her death as a powerful symbolic statement. They intended to publicly destroy the woman who had dared to usurp male authority. She resolved that her final act of political resistance would be to deny them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would face the machine she had inadvertently helped create with the unyielding stoic dignity of the ancient Roman heroes she had admired since she was a child in her father's library. The conciergerie was not a prison designed for long-term confinement. It was a processing center for the guillotine. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and unwashed bodies. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded cells. Yet, even in this bleak environment, Madame Roland maintained a rigid, almost unnatural composure. She was acutely aware that her final days would be scrutinized by history. She refused to offer her enemies the spectacle of a broken woman. Fellow prisoners later recorded their astonishment at her demeanor. While others wept or paced their cells in terror, she remained remarkably serene. She spoke quietly with those who shared her confinement. She offered them words of philosophical comfort. She dressed carefully each morning, maintaining a standard of personal dignity that defied the squalor surrounding her. This was not merely vanity. It was a deliberate political act of defiance. By refusing to show fear, she was rejecting the authority of the tribunal that sought to destroy her. Her trial commenced on the morning of November 8, 1793. The Revolutionary Tribunal was a formidable instrument of state terror. It was not a court designed to discover the truth. It was a mechanism designed to eliminate political opponents swiftly and ruthlessly. The public prosecutor was Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville. He was a man renowned for his cold efficiency and his absolute dedication to the Jacobin cause. He had recently secured the execution of Queen Marie Antoinette in the very same courtroom. The courtroom was packed with hostile spectators. The radical sections of Paris had sent their most vocal citizens to witness the destruction of the Girondin intellect. As she entered the room, she was greeted with jeers and insults. Ignoring the jeers of the hostile crowd, she focused her formidable attention entirely on the judges. The charges against her were sweeping and largely baseless. She was accused of participating in a royalist conspiracy. She was accused of inciting civil war in the provinces. However, the true nature of her perceived crime quickly became apparent during the questioning. Fouquier-Tinville did not focus on verifiable actions. He focused on her shadow power. He interrogated her about her salon. He demanded to know the extent of her influence over her husband's official duties. He accused her of manipulating the government from behind the scenes, using her intellect to corrupt the men who held official office. This line of questioning reveals the deep systemic anxiety of the revolutionary state. They were attempting to prosecute her intelligence. They were attempting to criminalize the very fact that a woman had possessed the strategic capacity to direct a political faction. Madame Roland attempted to mount a logical, reasoned defense. She was a brilliant speaker. Essie. He dismantled the prosecution's arguments with precise forensic skill. She pointed out the lack of documentary evidence. She defended her husband's administration, citing official records and public decrees. However, the tribunal was not interested in logic. When her eloquence began to clearly expose the absurdity of the charges, the judges simply cut her off. They ordered her to remain silent. They refused to allow her to call witnesses. They denied her the right to a legal counsel. Realizing that the legal process was a complete sham, she shifted her strategy. She stopped trying to win an acquittal. She began to speak directly to posterity. She addressed the judges with a calm, chilling contempt. She stated that she pitied them, for they were sending innocent citizens to their deaths while claiming to serve liberty. Historical accounts suggest that her refusal to show deference infuriated the tribunal. After a brief deliberation, the verdict was delivered. She was found guilty of treason against the Republic. The sentence was death by guillotine to be carried out that same afternoon. She received the sentence without a physical tremor. She stood up, looked directly at her judges, and delivered a final stinging rebuke. She thanked them for judging her worthy of sharing the fate of the great men they had already assassinated. It was a final assertion of her intellectual equality. She was claiming her place alongside the male leaders of the Girondin faction who had perished before her. She was returned briefly to the conciergerie to prepare for the execution. Her hair was cut short at the back of her neck to ensure the blade would not be obstructed. Her hands were bound behind her back. She was placed into a wooden cart alongside another condemned prisoner. His name was François Lamarche, a former government official. The cart began its slow journey across Paris, heading towards the Place de la Révolution. The journey was brutal. The streets were lined with angry crowds. They screamed obscenities. They threw refuse at the cart. Lamarche was visibly terrified. He was trembling violently and weeping. In a remarkable display of human empathy amidst unimaginable horror, Madame Roland spent the entire journey comforting him. Despite her bound hands and the horrific abuse raining down on her, she spoke to him softly. She offered him courage. She managed to coax a faint smile from him before they reached the square. The guillotine stood at the center of the Place de la Révolution. Near the scaffold, the revolutionary government had erected a massive clay statue of liberty. It was intended to symbolize the triumph of the Republic. When she descended from the cart, she was offered the opportunity to be executed first. It was a minor mercy, allowing the condemned to avoid watching another person die. She declined. She insisted that Lamarche go before her. She argued that seeing her blood would cause him unnecessary suffering. The executioner initially refused, citing strict orders regarding the sequence. She looked at him and quietly asked if he could truly refuse a woman's final request. The executioner yielded. She watched Lamarche die with unwavering stoicism. When her turn came, she stepped lightly up the wooden stairs. She did not hesitate. As she was positioned beneath the heavy blade, she turned her head. She looked away from the executioner and the screaming mob. She fixed her eyes on the towering clay statue of liberty. It was in this final fleeting moment that she delivered her enduring verdict on the French Revolution. It was not a scream of terror. It was not a plea to God. It was a sharp, brilliant, and devastating political critique. She said, "O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" The blade fell. The life of Jean-Marie Flippant, Madame Roland, was extinguished. She was 39 years old. The shock waves of her execution shattered what remained of her world. Upon hearing of her death, Jean-Marie Roland stepped out of hiding and drove a sword through his own heart, refusing to live in a world stained with such crimes. Months later, François Buzot, the man she secretly loved, was found dead in a field, having taken his own life to escape the guillotine. The destruction of the moderate Girondins was absolute, yet the radical republic could not entirely erase her legacy. Her secretly smuggled memoirs survived the reign of terror, providing a devastating counter-narrative to Jacobin propaganda. Madame Roland's story remains a profound historical warning. She proved that the strategic genius to govern a nation is not bound by gender. However, her fate also exposes the fatal vulnerability of shadow power. She helped engineer the machinery of a new republic, only to be crushed beneath its falling pillars.